You sit 12 feet from the most powerful person in the building. You have no direct reports, no product, no P&L, no line on the org chart that makes anyone really comfortable. And yet somehow, nothing moves without you. Your title is Chief of Staff, which sounds governmental, almost military. And that's not an accident, because what you actually do is closer to wartime operations than anything resembling a normal tech career. You manage the CEO's priorities, translate their half-formed instincts into executable strategy, and serve as a human firewall between the leader of a $100 billion company and the 600 people who need 5 minutes of their time every single day. You don't build the product. You build the conditions under which the product gets built. You don't set the vision. You make sure the vision survives contact with reality. You are not the principal. You are the principal's most dangerous instrument. And the strangest part is, no one outside the executive floor really understands what that means. From the outside, it looks like proximity, like you lucked into adjacency, like you're an executive assistant with better clothes and a slightly more ambiguous LinkedIn headline. From the inside, it's something else entirely. You are the person who knows what the CEO actually thinks before they say it in the all-hands. You are the person who rewrites the board deck at 11 p.m. because the narrative shifted after a call with the lead independent director. You are the person who tells a senior vice president, politely and without apology, that their initiative just got deprioritized. And no, the CEO will not be taking a meeting about it. You are leverage without a title anyone respects on first glance, influence without ownership, trust without tenure. Welcome to the most powerful job in big tech that nobody can explain at a dinner party. 1. The selection. You didn't apply for this. Not really. There's no posting on the careers page that says Chief of Staff to CEO, must be comfortable with ambiguity, political triangulation, and receiving calendar invites at 5:47 a.m. on a Sunday. The role finds you, or more precisely, the CEO finds you. Maybe you were a senior product manager who ran a cross-functional initiative that should have collapsed but didn't, because you held it together through sheer organizational willpower and a talent for making 7 VPs feel like they were all getting what they wanted. Maybe you were in corporate strategy and the CEO noticed that your memos were the only ones that didn't require a follow-up meeting to understand. Maybe you were a former consultant, McKinsey, BCG, Bain, and someone on the executive team remembered that you were the engagement manager who could actually talk to operators without making them want to leave the room. However it happened, the CEO pulled you aside. Maybe after a leadership offsite. Maybe during one of those hallway conversations that technically aren't meetings, but reshape entire org structures. And they said something like, "I need someone to help me run the machine, not manage a team, run the machine." And you said yes. Because of course you said yes. The CEO of a company worth more than the GDP of most European nations just told you they trust you. Personally. That kind of access doesn't come with a recruiter's email. It comes once. You show up on day 1 and there's no onboarding deck. No 30-60-90 plan. There's a laptop, a badge with a slightly higher clearance level than you expected, and a Slack message from the CEO's executive assistant, who, by the way, is the actual gatekeeper of the universe, that says, "Here's the calendar, you'll figure it out," and you will. But not before the first week teaches you something that no MBA program ever covered. In big tech, power is not distributed by org chart. It's distributed by calendar access, information asymmetry, and who gets CC'd on which emails. You now sit at the intersection of all three. Your comp is strong, somewhere between a senior director and a VP, depending on the company. RSUS, that vest on a schedule designed to keep you loyal through at least 2 earnings cycles. The package is generous. It has to be. Because what they're buying isn't your output. It's your silence, your judgment, and your ability to operate in the space between what the CEO says publicly and what they actually believe. You haven't even attended your first executive staff meeting yet, but you already know more than most VPs ever will. That's the gift. It's also the trap. 2. The operating system. Within 3 weeks, you understand something that takes most executives years to learn. The CEO does not run the company. The company runs at the CEO, and the CEO's job is to decide which of the 1,000 things hurtling toward them actually matters. Your job is to be the filter. Every morning starts the same way. You open the CEO's calendar, which looks less like a schedule and more like a chessboard mid-game, and you triage. There are 6 meeting requests that came in overnight from SVPs who just need 15 minutes. There's a board member who wants a pre-meeting before the pre-meeting for next quarter's board session. There's a policy issue bubbling in Brussels that government relations flagged but hasn't escalated properly. There's a product review that was supposed to happen last Thursday but got bumped because the CEO took an unscheduled call with a sovereign wealth fund LP who's also a major cloud customer. And there's a Slack thread in the exec channel that's 300 messages long about a reorg rumor that you planted 2 days ago to see who would leak it. Yes, you do that now. Information isn't just something you manage, it's something you deploy. You learn the rhythm fast. Mondays are strategy, Tuesdays are product, Wednesdays are people, meaning performance conversations, succession discussions, and the quiet politics of who's being groomed and who's being managed out. Thursdays are external, investor relations, press prep, policy. Fridays are supposed to be deep work, which in practice means the CEO cancels 2 things and you backfill the gaps with whatever crisis didn't fit earlier in the week. Your tools are deceptively simple. A shared Google Doc where you and the CEO track the top 5 priorities that actually matter, not the ones on the corporate strategy slide, the real ones. A private Slack channel with no name, just you two, and occasionally the general counsel when something is sensitive enough to require legal air cover. A weekly one-on-one that technically lasts 30 minutes but functionally never ends, because the CEO texts you after with the thing they actually wanted to say but couldn't while the EA was rotating people through the glass-walled conference room. You attend every executive staff meeting. You rarely speak. When you do, people listen. Not because of your title, but because everyone knows that your words are a proxy for the CEO's thinking. This is power. It is also a very specific kind of loneliness. Because you can never fully be yourself in that room. You are always, permanently, an extension of someone else's authority. The SVPs learn quickly what you are. Some treat you like a peer, some treat you like a spy. Both are correct. 3. The shadow cabinet. Here's something no one tells you about proximity to power. It doesn't just give you information, it gives you obligation. An obligation at this altitude is indistinguishable from identity erosion. You start losing your weekends around month 2. Not dramatically. No one sends you a memo that says, Saturdays are canceled. It happens the way everything happens at the executive level, gradually, then all at once. The CEO is preparing for an analyst day, and the messaging framework needs to land perfectly because the stock is flat and the street is skeptical about the AI pivot. So you spend Saturday afternoon rewriting talking points in a hotel lobby in San Jose because the CEO is at a board dinner and wants to align on narrative before Monday's dry run. You tell yourself it's temporary. It is not temporary, it is the job. By month 3, your phone becomes a biometric extension of your nervous system. You check it before your eyes fully open. Not because you're anxious, though you are, but because you've learned that the distance between early signal and full crisis is about 45 minutes in a company this size. A product outage, a leaked internal memo, a viral tweet from a former employee, a regulator filing something unexpected. You are the first person the CEO calls, not the general counsel, not the head of comms, you. Because you're the one who can synthesize the legal exposure, the reputational risk, the board optics, and the internal morale hit into a single coherent paragraph before anyone else has finished reading the article. You become fluent in a language that has no dictionary. The CEO is thinking about this means a decision is coming and you should prepare the ground. Let's revisit after Q3 means it's dead, grieve quietly. I want to hear more perspectives means the CEO has already decided but needs political cover. Can you take a first pass? Means you are writing the final version and it will go out under someone else's name. You learn to decode not just what the CEO says, but what they don't say, what they almost say, and what they say to you in the elevator that contradicts what they said in the room. The hardest part isn't the hours, it's the relationships. You used to have peers. Directors and senior PMs who you came up with, people you'd get drinks with after work, people who'd text you complaints about leadership. That's over now. Not because you've changed, though you have, but because they know where you sit. Every conversation carries a faint undertone of calculation. People are friendly, but they're also auditioning. They want to know what the CEO thinks about their org. They want you to carry a message upward. They want access, and you are the access. So the drinks become less frequent, and when they do happen, there's a moment, usually around the second round, where someone leans in and says, "So, between us?" And you realize this was never social. It was lobbying. You build a new social circle. It's very small. It includes the CEO's EA, who knows more about power dynamics than anyone with an MBA. It includes the CFO's chief of staff, because you two are the only people in the building who understand what it means to have authority that's entirely borrowed. And it includes maybe 1 or 2 board members' assistants, because the board's calendar is the one thing even the CEO can't fully control. And you need allies there. You eat lunch at your desk. You expense very little. You fly business class when you travel with the CEO and economy when you don't, because optics matter, and you've learned that your role survives on the perception of selflessness. The moment anyone thinks you're building your own empire, you're finished. Your title is Chief of Staff. Your actual job title, if anyone were honest, would be the person who makes the CEO look like they're running the company effortlessly while absorbing every cost of that illusion. 4. The political animal. Somewhere around month 6, you stop being an operator and become a strategist. Not because anyone promotes you into it, but because the information you hold forces it. You now know which SVP is underperforming before the board does. You know which acquisition target the CEO is quietly circling. You know that the head of engineering is being courted by a competitor and that HR doesn't know yet, because the recruiter reached out through a personal Gmail. You know that the company's position on a major policy issue is about to shift, and that the public statement will say one thing while the internal directive says another. This knowledge is power, and it is poison, because now you have to make choices. When the CEO asks, "What do you think about Sarah's org?" they're not making conversation, they're calibrating. Your answer might accelerate someone's promotion or trigger a quiet restructuring. When you write the pre-read for the quarterly business review, the order in which you present the business units isn't neutral, it's editorial. The unit that goes first gets the most airtime. The one buried on slide 38 is being set up for a conversation that no one will enjoy. You become, whether you wanted to or not, a political actor. Not in the Machiavellian sense, not scheming, not backstabbing, but in the structural sense. You shape agendas, you sequence decisions, you decide who gets the CEO's attention and who doesn't, and every one of those micro decisions compounds into organizational outcomes that affect thousands of people who will never know your name. The executives who understand this treat you with a respect that borders on wariness. The ones who don't understand it tend to find out the hard way, usually when a priority they assumed was safe quietly disappears from the CEO's tracker and no one can tell them exactly when it happened or why. You learn to document everything, not out of paranoia, but out of survival. Because when something goes wrong, and in a company this size, something always goes wrong, the postmortem will search for a decision point. And if that decision point traces back to a recommendation you made in a private Slack message at 10:47 p.m., you need to be able to show your reasoning. The CEO will not protect you publicly. They can't. The role requires that you remain invisible, even in failure. This is the deal. You get proximity, information, and influence. You give up credit, visibility, and the ability to fail in public without consequence. It is, on paper, a terrible trade. And yet you stay. Because the truth is, and this is the part that's hard to explain to anyone who hasn't lived it, there is nothing in corporate life that matches the intellectual intensity of this job. Every day is a different problem. Every week is a different crisis. You are operating at the exact intersection of strategy, politics, psychology, and execution, and you are doing it at a scale that affects markets, regulators, and the daily experience of 100,000 employees. It's addictive. That's the part they don't tell you in the exit interview. 5. The exit geometry. Nobody stays chief of staff forever. The role has a half-life, 18 months to 3 years, depending on the CEO's rhythm and your own tolerance for sustained invisibility. The question isn't whether you leave, it's how and into what. There are 3 doors. Door 1, You convert the access into an operating role. The CEO places you as a VP or GM over a business unit, a product line, or a new initiative that needs someone who understands how the machine works. This is the golden path. You go from shadow to spotlight, carrying an institutional map that no external hire could replicate. It works if you can make the psychological transition from advisor to owner. Some people can't. They've spent so long translating the CEO's instincts that they've forgotten how to have their own. Door 2. You leave for another company at a senior level. Your resume now carries a signal that recruiters understand even if job boards don't. You were the trusted operator for one of the most powerful people in technology. Private equity firms want you for operating partner roles. Late-stage startups want you as COO. Other big tech companies want you to do the same job for their CEO, which sounds flattering until you realize it means starting the entire psychological cycle over again with a stranger. Door 3. You burn out. Quietly. Not the dramatic kind. No public breakdown, no tearful resignation email. Just a slow, irreversible depletion. You realize you haven't had an original thought about your own career in 14 months. Your identity has fused so completely with the CEO's agenda that you can't remember what you actually wanted before you took this job. You leave without a clear next step, take 3 months off that were supposed to be one, and eventually resurface in a role that's objectively impressive but feels, privately, like a step down from the center of gravity you once occupied. Most chiefs of staff land somewhere between door 1 and door 2. The smart ones negotiate their exit before they need one. They plant the seed around month 12. I'd love to eventually run something. And the good CEOs, the ones who deserve the loyalty you've given them, make it happen. The mediocre ones nod and keep you in the chair for another year because replacing you would be inconvenient. Here's the final irony. When you leave, the company barely notices. Not because you didn't matter, but because the entire architecture of the role was designed to be invisible. The meetings still happen. The priorities still get tracked. Someone else sits 12 feet from the CEO and learns the language of almost saying and not quite deciding and everything in between. But you'll carry something that doesn't show up on a resume. You'll carry the knowledge of how power actually works, not the TED Talk version, not the business school case study, but the real thing. The version that runs on trust, timing, information control, and the willingness to be important without ever being seen. That's what the job gave you. A private education and institutional power that cost you 2 years and most of your personality. Whether that was worth it depends on what you do next. And if nothing else, you'll never sit in another meeting without knowing exactly who in the room has real authority and who's performing it. That instinct doesn't fade. It just makes dinner parties slightly unbearable. So yeah, Chief of Staff. The most powerful job no one understands. The most invisible job everyone underestimates. And the fastest way to learn that the top of the org chart is just a quieter, more expensive kind of chaos. Subscribe for more careers that sound like compliments but feel like commitments.